Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Changed by Fire by Quinn Arthurs and Harper Wylde, narrated by Heather Costa and Brandon Utah. Prologue. Molly. If I didn't get to have sex soon, I was going to kill someone. At the rate things were going, that someone was going to be my brother. I was done caring that Theo was mated to one of my best friends. He had always been protective of me, especially after we'd been forced to flee the rebellion to escape the council's reach. But this was getting ridiculous. No matter where I went or who I was with, he seemed to be around every corner. Sighing, I pulled open the dresser drawer and shoved a stack of clothing inside, with more force than necessary. It was bad enough that I'd just turned 17 and had to share a room with my mother to conserve space at the newest base we'd relocated to. But feeling like I had a personal babysitter every time I tried to interact with the male species had worn me out and left me frustrated. I knew Theo's overprotectiveness came from a place of love, and given the threats against us, it wasn't completely unwarranted. But this was supposed to be my time to find myself, and the mates who were supposed to be mine. How in the world was I supposed to do that with a kraken cock-blocking my every move? Returning to my suitcase, I double-checked that it was empty and zipped it up before looking around the room for a place to stash it. I hoped I wouldn't need it again for a while. This was already the third base we'd been to in 2 months. But if the rumors were true, this one would be home for the foreseeable future. And I wouldn't lie, the stability sounded nice. When Nix and Joshua had been taken by Councilman Williams on Thanksgiving, Renee had been quick to spread word to the rebellion, as well as our families and friends. I wasn't sure if she'd been able to smell the fear wafting off the councilman, or if maybe her bond with Kieran had spurred a touch of prophecy inside her. Either way, she'd been prepared for the worst, though I wasn't sure any of us could have predicted the terrible events that happened that Thanksgiving night. Cedric had been visiting me that day to help prepare meals for the less fortunate shifter groups on the island, when Renee had burst in, her eyes wild and frightened, though she remained composed, as she insisted it was time to pack and spread the word to flee. Cedric hadn't even hesitated, launching himself in front of me, his lips pulled back in a snarl, as though he expected council members to pour through the door after her to try and take me away from him. The soft mattress dipped under me as I sat on the bed, remembering that fateful day. It had been terrifying, and yet a smile curved my lips as I thought about Seti. I hadn't said anything to Theo yet, but I thought he might be my mate. I'd hoped some alone time with Cedric would let me decide for certain. But once Theo gathered my mom and me, and had gotten us off the island, alone time had been a rarity. I was just glad Cedric and his family had escaped with us. Leaving him behind would have been awful. Truthfully, I wasn't sure how Nix had done it with Joshua. Every day I saw the toll it took on her, and the rest of her mates. I'd never seen her so unsettled. Flopping backward, I stared at the ceiling as I let my legs dangle over the side of the bed. Part of me felt guilty for even thinking about sex, with everything we had going on with the rebellion. More and more shifters were finding their way to our ever-changing outposts. We couldn't risk staying in one location for too long, for fear that council spies might bring our whereabouts to their attention. That the council had brutally destroyed one of its own had many who'd previously been on the fence about joining our cause uprooting and joining us as we fled. It was either that or their fear of remaining on the council's side and going up against Nix. Her notoriety had risen early as high as the council's, though her fame and the reason for its existence hadn't thrilled her. Even here, amongst the rebellion members, some watched Nix with eyes filled with fear instead of awe. She'd incinerated a council member, seemingly as easy as breathing. Add in Ishida's lies about Nix's involvement in his daughter Amaya's death, although his mind was clearly shattered, and shifters tended to give Nix a wide berth. With Councilman LaCroix and Councilman Khan dead, we were down to 4 council members who posed a threat. Councilman Rahl, Maldonado, Ishida, and Stepanov. Groomed to join the council from a young age, Joshua had been able to denounce Nix and the rebellion, and take his place, filling Councilman LaCroix's position, though it had come at a heavy personal cost. His father, Councilman Williams, ruled at his side, trying to appease the council, while also working to keep his son safe as Joshua aided the rebellion and fed us information. And what had been just a dream to many was now very real. Our rebellion strongholds were bursting at the seams as we found room for defectors from the Council's lands looking for shelter and protection in exchange for bolstering our numbers. Although it was clear the Council had attempted to conceal the events of Thanksgiving, word had still spread quickly. Some of our first new members had been the servants and guards in attendance that day who had fled with their families in fear that their lives would be sacrificed to keep the Council's weakness a secret. They weren't overreacting either. Several shifters who had worked at the lodge had disappeared without a trace. More dissenters followed, sneaking off the island by boat, air, or on the backs of sea creatures able to traverse the Gulf to freedom. What had once been a small movement had turned into an ever-growing war. Never before had mythologicals and animal shifters worked side by side, though harmony was far from achieved. The unrest among the factions was a constant political undercurrent that threatened to derail us from the inside out. With victory a very real possibility, each faction strove to draw more members to their own parties, hoping to influence what the shifter world became once we reached the other side. While relations between the factions were taut, at least we were all looking toward a future that involved the downfall of the current council. None of us allowed ourselves to think of what would happen if we failed. I settled more comfortably onto my bed and turned to stare at my mother's empty mattress. The comforter was rough, nothing at all like the one I had on my bed back home, and the scratchy fabric irritated my tender skin. The light spilling through the window was dim, the sun sliding just above the horizon before sinking into night, as per usual with winter in Alaska. But my internal clock knew it was nearing dinner, despite the constant dusk. I missed my own room, my own bed. Even as I thought the words, I bit my cheek, attempting to wipe them from my brain. Guilt aided me, and I shifted, hugging my pillow to my chest as I struggled to ease away the tears welling at the corners of my eyes. My heart longed for the delicious smell of my mom's baking that used to fill my house, the pictures that decorated the walls bursting with happy memories from my youth, and the safety I used to feel within that structure, though I knew what lay outside the front door was anything but. Here, however, I was faced daily with the stark truth, the reminder of the oppression we faced under a corrupt council. The hardship was etched into the worried lines of the refugees' faces. Everything had changed. Now, instead of fretting over finishing high school and courting the men who'd bid on me at the gala, I was faced with combat training and helping my mother in the clinic where she worked tirelessly, treating anyone who was sick or injured. Together, we'd been preparing medical kits that could be used to triage the wounded amidst a battle, while the more experienced medical professionals were working on anti-venoms that could counteract the most powerful shifters the council might use against us. Everyone had a place in the rebellion, preparing for the war on our doorstep. Yet, just like my brother, I struggled to find my place. My standing as a female Kraken shifter hadn't garnered me any great respect among the council, and while I was a respected member of the rebellion, I wrestled to discover my usefulness amid powerful mythologicals and cunning animal shifters. Despite my creature's size and power, being a Kraken, especially a female Kraken, wasn't considered much of a strength. If anything, being a sea creature on land felt like being a fish out of water. Literally. There was little I could do this far into the Alaskan mountains. Unhappy with my assessment, my Kraken hissed in my head, but we both knew my depiction was accurate. She was significantly smaller than my brother's Kraken, though she would quickly disprove anyone who thought to tell us we were weak. Like Theo, my Kraken could lend me physical strength, and both water and ice manipulation came easily to us. But anyone who needed such powers deferred to my brother rather than me. My only other ability allowed me to speak to sea creatures, and the need for that this far away from any body of water made it a futile skill. It seemed I didn't fit anywhere, and I was left feeling bereft. Theo never meant to do it, but I felt like I lived my life in his shadow, never measuring up, never being enough on my own. Even the gala had been a perfect example. Despite how excited I'd been, I knew some of the bids had been strangely made. Not to get to me, but due to Theo. His own place as Nyx's guardian and potential mate had increased our status in the eyes of several shifters, and many hoped to get in on the ground floor, so to speak, desiring to catch the favor of the Phoenix and the male who'd rule her. I scoffed, even as a sick feeling took up residence in the pit of my stomach. The Council's view on women was just one of the antiquated ideas I couldn't wait for the shifter world to move past. How we'd devolved so far that women were seen for nothing more than the status of their wombs. Lower-ranked women wanted for their ability to breed shifter children that would hold the father's traits, and higher-ranked women coveted for the strength and power they could breed into their children was sickening. While higher mythological women had more choice in who they took as lovers or mates, they were still bargaining chips to be directed by the old, selfish men of their families, their wombs in exchange of wealth and favor. Thankfully, Theo had a good sense of what bids had been calculatingly made and had turned them away, sparing me from having to deal with shady men only looking to exploit my relationship with Nyx. I knew if Nyx ever found out about any of it, she'd be fuming. It was just one more reason I loved her like a sister. Theo had turned away the more lecherous males who had attempted to bid as well. Not like that was any surprise from my overprotective big brother. The way their eyes had slid over me had made it clear I was less than nothing in their minds, just a means to an end, a body that could bear children who would take on their own shifter traits. Theo's words had nearly dripped with ice when he turned them away, but I had still felt their gazes on me. However, I knew fate could never be so cruel as to deem one of those evil men my mate. By the end of the gala, I'd had a handful of bids with real potential, and I was lucky that some of them had been members of the rebellion who had joined the mass exodus with me. All except for Joshua. But I had to remind myself he wasn't mine, despite how I cared for him. He was a good man, one I'd formed a connection with. But that was before I knew he wasn't a possibility. While I'd desperately hoped the basilisk would have bid on me at the gala, I didn't know at that time he was one of Nyx's true mates. As disappointed as I was, I could never be mad at her, or Joshua, for following their hearts. They were true mates, after all, and I'd never stand in the way of fate. That didn't mean I wasn't jealous, though. Nyx had managed to find 6 true mates, despite only being among the shifters for a few months. Rennie had managed to find 4, 3 of whom she'd known since she was a child. So far, I hadn't even found 1. A few of the males who had placed bids on me had been sweet and kind, but I hadn't felt that soul-deep connection with anyone. Though if I was being honest, I had greatly enjoyed the attention, not to mention the gifts. Wren and Hawthorne, both of whom had defected with me, were the only ones who stood apart from the group. And while the time I'd spent with them hadn't been bad, I highly doubted they were my true mates. Then I had come across Cedric, and something inside of me had lit up. I'd wanted to shriek my fury at Nyx when they had gone on their dates together, even though I logically knew nothing was going on between them, and it was all for show. My Kraken still hadn't liked it. When he began to spend time with me, I was even more sure he was meant to be mine. Luckily, everything was different now. I hadn't been looking forward to begging the council to allow him to be my mate, if he agreed to take me as one, that was. Away from the council, the dating and mating rules were different. No longer did I need to seek permission for whom I took as a mate. If both parties agreed to make the commitment to each other, we were free to love and bond as we saw fit. It was liberating, if not a little nerve-wracking, that the choice was completely in my hands. There was no need for bids or sanctioned dates or chaperones, much to Theo's chagrin. I had made the mistake of mentioning the possibility of Cedric being my mate to Theo in a huff when he'd chased Cedric away from a heated makeout session. It was odd to see my tan brother turn a sickly shade of green, though that might also have had something to do with the fact that he'd seen Cedric's hand up my shirt. Since then, Theo had been doing everything in his power to keep Cedric busy and away from me. If he didn't stop soon, I was going to go directly to Nyx, knowing she'd take him in hand, and it'd cause less drama than me kicking him in the balls or attempting to drown him. Besides, it wasn't like Cedric was chomping at the bit to tie me down in a mating. So far, regardless of my hints and a few heated moments between us, He'd yet to speak of a lifetime commitment, despite the way his eyes would heat and soften when he'd stroke a hand down my cheek. I knew it was selfish, but I couldn't help wanting time with just him, someplace we couldn't be interrupted. I needed to know what he felt about me before I figured out if he was a true mate or not. The last thing I wanted was for a man to feel tied to me out of obligation rather than feelings, and Cedric's hesitation had been hard to read. Was he turned off because of my age? 17 was old enough to mate in the shifter world, so I doubted that was it. My looks? From the way he'd responded during our kisses, I kind of doubted that was it. All I could assume then was that it was due to my kraken. She shrieked in my head, hating that idea as much as I did. I brushed the tears away, breathing deeply and evenly as I firmed my jaw. Well, I was not going to wait forever. If he wasn't sure about mating with me, then I'd just have to find a way to prove myself. I'd show him exactly what a kraken was capable of. That werewolf better watch out. This kraken was officially unleashed.
Chapter 1. Joshua. If I had to watch one more disgusting display of the Council lording their power over lower mythologicals and animal shifters, I was going to be fucking sick. My stomach churned as I observed Councilman Stepanoff and Maldonado paw at the women they'd called to entertain them after dinner, cowing them into compliance as they pulled them into their laps and teased them with dry, morbid humor that served to terrify rather than seduce. I swirled the amber whiskey in my crystal glass, not fond of the taste, but not stupid enough to turn it down. Even the smallest movement was noticed and analyzed, and as the newest member of the council, everything I did was under scrutiny, especially given my connection to Nix and the guys. Claiming to renounce my mate had been the hardest decision I'd ever made, and yet it had also been the easiest. Hard because Nix owned my heart and soul, and I missed her with a longing I couldn't describe. Easy because keeping her safe was the most important thing I'd ever done with my life thus far. Even doing it to protect her, the words had tasted like ash on my tongue, and I thanked the practice I'd received over the years, so they'd come out as honeyed lies, perfect to the Council's prejudiced ears. Aiding the rebellion, which was the only way we stood a chance of overthrowing the depraved Council, was all that kept me going during this trying time. I hated being away from Nix. I hated not getting to hold her in my arms. But the councilmen had revenge in their eyes, and a vendetta in their black hearts. A death wish against my mate and friends. And I'd do whatever it took to protect them. Even sacrificing my own happiness, or even worse, my life. So here I sat, sipping the burning liquid that spread fire throughout my stomach while letting it relax me into a semblance of casual I didn't feel internally. I'd watch, and I'd wait, and when the time was appropriate, I'd slip away and retire to my chambers here within the lodge, the only place I found peace in this enemy territory I once truly called home.
"Joshua!"
Stepanoff called, snapping me out of my reverie and pulling my attention down the table to where he was seated. I worked hard to stare past the half-naked woman unbuttoning his shirt, peeling it back to reveal pale skin and a toned physique. Thanks to our genetics, most shifters stayed in their prime regardless of age. Gaspard, for instance, had visibly aged, but he was one of the most powerful shifters I knew. I hummed, arching an eyebrow in practiced nonchalance. I kept a confident, cool air about myself, one I knew the calculating Stepanoff approved of. He gazed at me shrewdly, and a cruel smile tugged one corner of his lips.
"I think you've sulked long enough. Pick a woman tonight and have your fill," he said.
A quick flick of his eyes had the servants running off to the side of the dining room and pulling the double doors open to allow 3 more women to enter, each wearing a demeaning outfit that put their assets on display. Only one of them proudly flaunted what she had, obviously willing to use her body to her advantage. There were still shifters who wished to gain the council's favor, even if it was in bed, hoping they'd be spared the impending wrath that was clearly brewing. A dangerous move, to be sure, one they desired would be to their benefit. While there had been many shifters who fled to the rebellion, there were far too many preening mythologicals left to bolster the council, inflating their egos as they attached themselves like leeches.
Yes,
Maldonado drawled, his Puerto Rican accent thicker with the buzz he had going. The metal goblet in his hand was garish, and he sipped from it as he assessed my choices over the rim of his glass. The fingers of his other hand trailed lazily along the bare back of the girl on his lap, dressed in just a bra and a long, flowing skirt. She tried desperately to hide her discomfort, but I could tell every execution Maldonado had ever performed was branded on her brain by the way she tried to keep her hands away from his stomach. Instead, she twined one through his thick, dark hair and ran her other hand over the expensive black button-down he wore, letting her fingers play along his chest.
"Which woman calls to you, young councilman?"
he goaded, the last word sounding more condescending than anything else. Maldonado had never liked me much, but perhaps that was because I always had been the natural choice as a leader over his pseudo-nephew, Griff, a cocky griffin shifter who thought much too highly of himself and would have made a terrible politician, though I knew from my father that Maldonado had argued he'd take my new position.
"Stepanoff, Maldonado, is this really necessary? Leave the poor boy alone. He's had enough to deal with between Annika's treachery and his new duties with the council. He doesn't need to worry about these kinds of trivial matters."
My father waved a hand in front of himself, as though he could dismiss the women Stepanoff had summoned. While the power among the council was supposed to be equal, everyone knew Stepanoff held just a little more than the rest, especially since he had Maldonado and Rahal in his back pocket. With Councilman LaCroix and Khan dead, and Ishida off the rails, that left only my father and me to offer any resistance to whatever Stepanoff had planned.
"Spoken by someone who hasn't had his dick wet in years,"
Maldonado sneered at my father, his face twisted in disgust, as though my dad was somehow less because he didn't take advantage of the women at his disposal.
"What I do in my private time, and with whom, is none of your business, Maldonado."
The tone my father used was full of power, his multicolored gaze, one blue eye, one green, a trait he hadn't developed until his death stare emerged, flashing like dangerous lightning. Maldonado glared but refused to look my father in the eye. I wanted to smile smugly, but kept my expression one of boredom.
"Which do you choose?"
Rahal interjected, not caring much about the pissing match going on across the table. His brown eyes were fastened on the simpering girl, exuding all the confidence and sex appeal, the two practically eye-fucking across the room.
"I'll take your leftovers. This time."
The muscle in my jaw jumped, while I tried not to grind my teeth together. Sloshing the rest of my whiskey against the crystal, I tipped it to my lips, downed the drink in one long gulp, and set the empty glass onto the wooden table before pushing my chair back. You're right. It's been too long since I've had a woman. But why settle for one when I can have two?
"You can have all 3, my boy, if they all suit."
Stepanoff wore a small, wicked smile, obviously seeing the displeasure on my dad's face. My father might be a basilisk, but Stepanov was the real snake. He thrived on sowing discord and malcontent. His hand crept up the thigh of the woman in his lap, while I stood and sauntered across the room. I couldn't stand to watch anymore, and if these girls were my ticket out of this room, I'd take it. I think Rahal already has his eye on the blonde. Who am I to get in the way of his good time? The question was rhetorical, and as much as my stomach turned to acid at the thought, the woman seemed ready and willing to be his plaything. The other two girls? Not so much. Ladies? I inclined my head at the two girls, both who were around my age. Neither was willing to look into my eyes, the reputation of my altar preceding me, though I didn't have the death stare my father did. After you. I motioned toward the exit, and they both went skittering off back through the door from whence they came. Ishida sidestepped the girls, letting them pass before entering the room.
"Finally moving on, Joshua?" he simpered. "I wonder what your precious phoenix would think of your betrayal."
My betrayal? I spat, letting all my hatred for Ishida bleed into my voice, the emotion easily covering my true feelings for Nyx. You know I have been released from my bid, and thus any fealty to the Phoenix deserter who fooled us all. I stepped into his personal space and stared down the celestial kitsune, motioning with my hands as I spoke. I have sworn my allegiance to this council, the very one I have dedicated my life to serving from a young age. Need I remind you that I share the throne, same as you? That I have proven my loyalty to the council time and time again? What more do you need to see from me before you are as pleased as the rest of the council with my place among you?
You forget, boy, venom dripped from the word, that I was there.
Ishida's eyes were crazed as he vibrated with virulent energy. When? I taunted. Where? I knew full well Ishida had spun his narrative over Nyx's involvement in Amaya's death, one that made Nyx the attacker and the murderer. According to Ishida, he'd stumbled on the entire affair only to view the moment Nyx incinerated his daughter to nothing more than ash on the wind. The large crater left in the forest that he couldn't cover up or hide was explained away as his reaction to grief and a hopeful retaliation against Nyx, though he claimed she was already gone by the time it careened from the heavens. Her mission was accomplished, and her competition destroyed. A tale he'd conveniently left me out of, so I wouldn't be questioned about the events of the day. The only person in the lodge who knew the truth was me, but Ishida and I both had something to hide, a mutually beneficial silence we'd unofficially agreed to. He didn't want anyone to know of his involvement in his daughter's death, looking to avoid the perceived weakness he'd be labeled with if the council and other shifters ever found out about how Nyx actually bested him. And I didn't want my true feelings nor the depth of my connection to the pretty phoenix to be uncovered either. Such information would surely mean my death. Luckily, I'd been able to weave my own tale, one that consisted of blind infatuation and lust that had quickly cleared when I saw what she'd done to Councilman Khan before siding with the rebellion. One forgiven after many tedious tasks, meant to test me before the council officially offered me my throne. Ishida's glare was only dissuaded by the sharp bark of Stepanov calling him to the table.
"You are late again. Let the boy go and join us, Ishida."
With one last incline of my head to the remaining councilmen, I took my leave, the long warning look my father shot me staying with me as I strode down the hall to the waiting women. My jaw ticked at the diminutive way they bowed and squirmed on their feet before following me. I led them down twisting hallways and descended a flight of stairs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?